Ukraine has a secret weapon in its war against Russia, and it's not what you might think. The term secret weapon might suggest a brand new stealth missile that Russian air defenses can't detect, let alone bring down, or a new air defense system that can bring down Russian drones and missiles that cost many times more. Maybe it even brings to mind cutting-edge AI-enabled battlefield intelligence systems that give Ukrainian commanders a complete picture of the battlefield before their Russian counterparts have poured their first shot of vodka for the day. All those systems are already in the works, but according to one retired high-ranking US general, Ukraine's secret weapon is something much simpler and more profound: adaptation. In a recent op-ed for the respected US journal The Bulwark, Lieutenant General Mark Hertling, retired, makes a compelling case that Ukraine's ability to outthink Russia and innovate accordingly has allowed it to regain the strategic initiative in the 5th year of the war. Here's how Hertling analyzes the situation and what it implies for the outcome of the conflict. Now, Hertling is far from your average armchair expert. He was commander of US Army Europe from 2011 to 2012. He also commanded the 1st Armored Division in Germany and Multinational Division North Forces during the surge in Iraq from 2007 to 2009. So, he knows a thing or two, not just about the Eastern European theatre, but about how wars are actually fought and won, operationally and strategically. And it's precisely this vast hands-on experience that he draws upon to construct this argument. There are many reasons why Ukraine has regained the strategic initiative, but they all come down to the same principle: adaptation, he writes. It's long been recognized that battle plans rarely go according to, well, plan. This conclusion is probably best summed up in the famous quote by Prussian Field Marshal Helmuth von Moltke the Elder, although often mistakenly attributed to his compatriot General Karl von Clausewitz. No plan of operations extends with any certainty beyond the first encounter with the main enemy forces, Moltke wrote in 1871. Only the layman believes that in the course of a campaign, he sees the consistent implementation of an original thought that's been considered in advance in every detail and retained to the end. As a result of this basic truism, Hertling says, military leaders have always spent enormous effort thinking about how to outmaneuver opponents and gain an advantage, because warfare is never static. One side always falters or becomes complacent, which allows the other side to adjust. Every battlefield evolves, every new technology creates both opportunities and risks, and every enemy at some point presents vulnerabilities. So victory, to a great extent, depends on which set of commanders is best able to recognize changing conditions promptly, discard outdated assumptions, and adapt decisively before the enemy does. These adaptations often involve comprehensive shifts in strategies and their implementation. A good example is Ukraine embracing drone warfare at scale to overcome its great disadvantage in manpower and conventional battlefield weaponry, at least compared to Russia. As we'll discuss a bit later, this move fundamentally changed and continues to shape the course of the war. But sometimes even subtle adaptations in the information space can make a massive difference to how things play out on the front lines, as demonstrated by this example. Hertling says that during his time in Iraq, US commanders realized that the phrases being used in communications, both with the US public and the Iraqis, needed to evolve. Initially, the US leaned heavily on the phrase "winning hearts and minds," which had been successful in garnering support domestically and in the operational space during previous US military operations against insurgencies. However, according to Hertling, we realized Iraqis didn't want Vietnam-era slogans, and they certainly didn't want to be like us. Instead, they wanted security, reliability, and partnership. We shifted our thinking toward the phrase "gaining trust and confidence" with both Iraqi soldiers and civilians, and we showed it by fighting alongside them rather than merely operating around them. This subtle shift in mindset, language, and operational approach went a long way toward winning the trust of the Iraqi people. It's a poignant example of how subtle changes can make a massive difference to the eventual outcome of a conflict. But the US was also forced to make much more visible and kinetic adaptations on the actual battlefield compared to its original plans. Because the US wielded incomparable force compared to the various militias it faced in Iraq. The insurgents quickly figured out the hard way that they couldn't fight fire with fire. so they changed the game. They switched to asymmetric tactics, for which the US wasn't prepared. They began to employ decentralized attacks, roadside bombs, and information operations designed to undermine public support and operational momentum. And for a while, the strategy worked. Hertling says the initial US responses lagged behind the evolving threat, in some cases for years. Eventually, however, US commanders and soldiers adjusted successfully. Intelligence was integrated more closely with operations. Counter-IED technologies were developed and deployed. Decentralized operations and electronic warfare were introduced, and closer partnership with local forces were established. In the end, as Hertling puts it, success came because American forces eventually learned faster than the enemy. But it's not always the case that the larger force ultimately prevails. With better thinking and faster adaptation, a smaller, less powerful force is capable of overcoming larger forces that are slower to adapt. And that's exactly what Hertling says is happening in Ukraine. There are numerous historical examples of how this kind of strategic adaptability has upended the status quo in the disadvantaged side's favour. The most famous is arguably the Battle of Thermopylae in 4080 BCE, where a small coalition of Greek forces, famously anchored by 300 Spartans, led by King Leonidas I, held off the vastly larger invading army of Xerxes I of Persia. The story was immortalized, with some fictional liberties, in the hit 2006 Zack Snyder directed movie 300. Although the Greeks were ultimately defeated in a tactical loss, the heroic stand inflicted heavy casualties on the Persians, inspired Greek unity, and delayed the Persian advance. This delay allowed Greek forces to regroup, leading to decisive victories at the Battle of Salamis and the Battle of Plataea, effectively ending the Persian invasion. But the passage of millennia hasn't blunted the effectiveness of small, adaptive forces overcoming larger, slower ones, if the right strategies and tactics are adopted timelessly. And more recent examples bear this out. Hertling points out to the Vietnam War. While he says the Tet Offensive in 1968 was an abject military failure for the North Vietnamese that effectively extinguished the Viet Cong as a fighting force, the Viet Cong adapted, avoiding essentially suicidal pitched battles against the much stronger US forces and turning instead to guerrilla tactics. In the end, these early asymmetric tactics caused the war to drag on for too long, and the cost to become too high for the US leadership to sustain politically. The US was compelled to withdraw. Vietnam remains under communist leadership to this day, albeit with a thriving socialist-oriented market economy and a healthy relationship with the US. Much closer to home in terms of Ukraine, Hertling also cites the example of Finland during the Winter War of 1939 to 1940. The Finns use asymmetric tactics like winter camouflage, ski-based mobility, and improvised weapons like Molotov cocktails to fight the massive Soviet Red Army. Hertling calls the result a draw, which is perhaps overstating the case somewhat. The war ended with the Moscow Peace Treaty, in which Finland ceded about 11% of its territory to the Soviet Union, including Karelia, part of the Saimaa, and islands in the Gulf of Finland. That's technically a military defeat. But Finland had managed to inflict heavy losses on the Soviets, and more importantly, retained its independence. National unity was greatly bolstered, and Finland gained international prestige, while the Soviet Union was expelled from the League of Nations for its aggression. In that sense, a draw is probably a fair description, and the parallels with today's conflict in Ukraine are striking. Hertling correctly points to the flaws in judging the state of war primarily in terms of territorial gains. Of course, the question of territory is important. Russia has occupied around 20% of Ukraine's territory, and Ukraine's ultimate aim is to expel the Russians from all of it and reclaim it. But warfare has changed dramatically, and in Ukraine, judging the state of war purely in terms of square miles gained by either side ignores the reality of what's actually happening on the battlefield and behind it. For starters, vast areas of the front lines in eastern Ukraine today can't be held with certainty to be under the control of one side or the other. In reality, they're massive grey zones, where whatever control either side has is at best tenuous. Ubiquitous FPV drones with a range of dozens of miles on both sides have meant that the armoured manoeuvres of the past have become unsustainable. With rare exception, neither side plunges into headlong assaults with columns of armoured vehicles and tanks to capture new territory these days. More often than not, such tactics simply result in burnt-out columns of vehicles which the other side can flaunt in videos. Now, less is more. Both sides now tend to advance with small infantry groups covered by artillery and drones. A village, or what remains of it, said to be held by one side, is often only held by a handful of troops. And the territory just beyond held villages still contains troops on the other side, even though battle maps may show the areas as under one army's control. These small group tactics, combined with the sheer length of the front lines and a shortage of manpower on both sides, mean that a limited number of infantrymen are able to sometimes penetrate deep behind the advanced positions of the enemy and dig in. With regular supplies arriving by drone, they can hold these positions for months, effectively destroying any notion of secure control over the area for the enemy. The ubiquitous use of drones means that the front lines are never really set in stone, but drones have also effectively drawn the so-called near rear into the battlefield itself. Gone are the days when an army could advance with columns, establish new advanced positions, and then maintain those positions using secure logistics and warehousing stretching dozens of miles into the rear. Today, with satellite and drone surveillance, and an array of precision strike missiles and shells in operation, the near rear isn't anywhere near as safe as it used to be. Indeed, for both sides, degrading logistics, disrupting command and control, and destroying supplies in the near rear seems to have become as high a priority as attacking advancing frontline forces. Hertling argues that Ukraine has adapted to these new battlefield realities much faster and more effectively than Russia has. Its strategy of employing drones, precision strikes, electronic warfare, and attacks on industrial infrastructure far from the front lines, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's long-range sanctions, has allowed Ukraine to regain the initiative in the war. As proof, he points to recent assessments from the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, that claim Russian forces experienced a net territorial loss across the theatre in April 2026 for the first time since Ukraine's Kursk incursion in 2024. Now, just a quick reminder to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. On the Military Show, we provide daily updates on the most important military developments and deep dives into what those developments mean. So hit that subscribe button so you never miss out. Now, depending on where you get your news, that ISW figure is the subject of some debate. The ISW's claim that Ukraine managed to claw back a net 72 square miles of territory during April has been widely publicized in Western and Ukrainian media, but there's unfortunately not much independent corroboration, at least yet. The Economist War Tracker suggests that this year, Russia, has suffered small but sustained territorial losses for the first time since October 2023, but without confirming the scale. And that's about it. For their part, the Russians are painting a very different picture. Russian Chief of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, recently stated that Russian forces had seized more than 1,000 square miles of territory, captured 80 settlements, and liberated the last remaining settlements in Luhansk Oblast during 2026. Geolocated footage appears to corroborate at least the last part of that statement. Hertling describes this massive difference in claims as the widening gap between Kremlin claims and battlefield reality. But who knows what's really going on? As we've explained, for either side, describing territory as under full control until the front lines have moved dozens if not hundreds of miles further into enemy territory is likely disingenuous at best. Most of it is, in reality, a grey zone, where control is never fully secure and positions can change hands, sometimes multiple times within the same day. Hertling doesn't see it like that. In his view, senior military leaders who exaggerate success often reveal deeper institutional weaknesses. In authoritarian systems, civilian and military leaders frequently attempt to shape reports to satisfy expectations rather than operational realities. Over time, those actions distort military and political decision-making, weaken adaptation, and cause strategic dysfunction. It's been happening in Russia since before the full-scale invasion, and it appears to be happening still. He's probably right, but it's a dangerous argument. While Russia has been caught multiple times providing what Russian military bloggers sarcastically refer to as beautiful reports, Ukraine hasn't been immune to beautifying its reports either. In April 2026, the commanders of the 14th Separate Mechanized Brigade and the 10th Army Corps were dismissed after an investigation revealed that they had concealed critical supply failures. Soldiers were found severely emaciated due to a lack of food and water, and positions were lost. The General Staff stated that the previous command had concealed the real state of affairs. Previously, in late 2025, the commanders of the 54th Mechanized Brigade and the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade were fired for systematically falsifying reports. They lied about holding positions around Siversk that the troops had already abandoned, leading to the city's capture by Russian forces with minimal resistance. Unfortunately, these are far from isolated incidents. As Ukrainian filmmaker and battalion commander Oleh Sentsov told the Ukrainska Pravda outlet, "The amount of lying in our state is enormous, and in the army, it has simply some immeasurable volume." By Hertling's logic, that would make Ukraine, like Russia, an authoritarian system, and that's certainly not the point he's trying to make. His point is that while Russia is lying about territorial gains and floundering, Ukraine continues evolving tactically and operationally. The second part of that statement is undoubtedly true. As Hertling explained, Ukrainian commanders have always understood they cannot indefinitely trade artillery shells, armored vehicles, and soldiers against a larger adversary with deeper reserves. So, instead of attempting to match the Russian quantitative advantage, Ukraine has increasingly shifted toward attacking vulnerabilities across the broader Russian military-industrial system. Instead of focusing on frontline attrition, Ukraine has shifted to more asymmetrical tactics. Specifically, by greatly increasing its stockpiles of long-range attack drones and missiles, it's increasingly targeted the infrastructure, logistics, energy production, navigation systems, and industrial facilities that sustain Russian combat operations. And there seems little doubt that these attacks are taking a heavy toll. A growing portfolio of verified footage confirms that increasing numbers of major oil refineries, fuel depots, explosive facilities, and plants connected to Russian drone and missile production are being hit, and ever more frequently. Ukrainian attacks recently damaged the Kirishi oil refinery near St. Petersburg, one of Russia's largest refining facilities. In recent weeks, they've also struck the VNIIR Progress plant in Chuvashia, which manufactures navigation and electronic warfare-resistant guidance systems used in Russian drones and missiles. And those are just two examples among many. For Hertling, these attacks reflect increasingly sophisticated intelligence collection and targeting priorities aimed at disrupting the connective tissue of Russia's military machine. Like Ukraine, Russian air defenses bring down the vast majority of these drones, but the high number of drones flying into Russia these days means that more and more leakers are finding their mark. And not just anywhere, but in Moscow and St. Petersburg, Russia's most prized and well-protected locations. Western intelligence assessments claim that, as a result, Russian authorities have increased security measures around Vladimir Putin and key Russian leadership facilities. Other reports claim that Ukrainian attacks, particularly on Moscow, have forced Russian authorities to reposition air defense systems to protect elite leadership facilities and critical infrastructure. Hertling doesn't dispute that some of this reporting may be somewhat overstated, but their accuracy, he suggests, is ultimately less important than the broader strategic reality they reflect. Ukraine has succeeded in bringing the war home to Russia. And you can see it on the faces of ordinary Russians, or rather on their phones. The government has restricted access to the Telegram app in Russia in an apparent effort to limit negative news about the war. In fact, you'll struggle to find a single Russian active channel where displeasure at this move isn't voiced. Combined with rising costs and an economy under serious pressure, this move has undoubtedly worsened the mood considerably inside Russia. According to the Russian state pollster Vtsayam, Putin's approval rating fell to 65.6% in late April 2026, marking the lowest level recorded since the beginning of the war against Ukraine. That's a significant decline of over 12 percentage points from December 2025, which prompted the state-controlled polling agency to revise its survey methodology to soften further blows. Of course, those are polling numbers many Western leaders can only fantasize about. According to recent US polls, President Donald Trump is still polling at around 39% approval rating, but there's a steady downward trend. Of Ukraine's biggest allies in Europe, Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz is the most popular, with an approval rating of just 19% and a disapproval rating of 76%. France's Emmanuel Macron trails him slightly with an 18% approval rate and 75% disapproval rate. And UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer, whose Labour Party was recently humiliated in local elections, is odds-on to be ousted in the near future. Only 11% of Britons believe he's been good or a great Prime Minister, and nearly 60% believe he's been poor or terrible, according to polling by YouGov. Still, a roughly 12% drop for Putin in just one quarter is a strong indicator that Ukraine's asymmetric strategy is working. Now, Hertling makes a strong case for how Ukraine is using its adaptability and asymmetric advantages to seize back the initiative. But unlike some other commentators, he doesn't come to the conclusion that this has put Ukraine firmly on a path to victory or that the war is near an end. Russia remains dangerous and capable of inflicting enormous destruction, he states. He also acknowledges Ukraine's severe manpower issues, the fact that it's completely dependent on foreign aid to remain functional as a state, and that it's at a major disadvantage in what's becoming a grinding war of attrition. Russia is taking heavy losses, but it has a greater capacity to withstand them simply due to its much larger size, economy, and population. It's also worth noting that the Pentagon's official assessment of the state of the war doesn't share Hertling's assessment that Ukraine has seized the strategic initiative as a result of its innovative tactics and greater adaptability. In its May 2026 report to Congress on Operation Atlantic Resolve, the Pentagon's Special Inspector General assesses that Russia almost certainly retains a more effective command and control system than Ukraine. It also almost certainly retains a higher ability to conduct persistent, high-tempo offensive maneuvers and holds the advantage in direct fires, logistics, force generation, and force protection. Russia has also achieved parity in tactical drone deployment, although Ukraine probably retains a more effective tactical, battlefield-focused intelligence capability than Russia. Still, as the 300, the Viet Cong, and the steadfast Finns in World War II have ably demonstrated, victory doesn't always mean vanquishing your enemy on the battlefield. At the beginning of the war, very few would have predicted that Ukraine would still be standing strong after 4 years of grinding, murderous war. But there it stands proudly for all to see. However, there's a slight chance Ukraine's escalations might backfire spectacularly. The increased pressures in Russia aren't leading to increased calls for capitulation or Putin's head. Instead, they seem to be having the opposite effect, with ever louder calls for a much tougher response to Ukraine from the public and influential leaders alike. Since it's highly debatable how much more Russia actually has in its conventional locker with which to deal such blows, there's the ominous prospect that Russia might resort to something more lethal, tactical, or even strategic nuclear weapons. The threat grows stronger each day. A nuclear war would likely remove Ukraine's major centers from the map and render the entire territory unlivable, along with potentially much of Europe, Russia, and even the US. But if it can be avoided, there's a very strong chance that Ukraine's stubborn resistance and mastery of adaptation are precisely what will ultimately preserve its sovereignty, dignity, and future, exactly as Hertling suggests. We'll of course keep you updated as the situation develops. This war twists and turns daily. But just in case Russia decides to go nuclear, check out this video about the safest places in the US to wait it out. Thanks for watching.